We're delighted to have you and looking forward to your discussion today.
Thank you so very much. I can't tell you how happy I am to have the opportunity to be here. I'm so excited to be associated with Balzilli, and it is exactly for the topic, because of the topic that I have the opportunity to speak about today. And I'll go ahead and start by just saying that I'm an engineer. We build things, and we're constantly engaged on this topic of why do we have water shortages? Why are there these presumed water treatment problems? Are we going to have the right technology? And so this talk, and I'll cut to the chase, this talk is very much about this notion of, is technology going to save us? And it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek thing I say, because I really think technology is misunderstood in this sector. And I wanted to talk about true opportunities, in my opinion, to advance water security and health in a changing climate. And so I'd like to talk about the lens through which I view this before we get into some of the experiences that have brought me to the very energized and emphatic position of, we need to rethink how we're looking at technology. And we have to remember that people engage with technology. And so I think that this is exactly the place to be talking about these issues. So a little bit about me. I am a classically trained engineer. I have 2 engineering degrees. I went to school in the States at MIT. I studied chemical engineering and environmental engineering, and I was so excited about building something that would make life better for people. And a classic case of being the child of 2 immigrants, my mother was so hopeful that I would become a medical doctor, and my father was so hopeful I'd become an electrical or mechanical engineer, that being a good kid, I went for public health engineering. And what I've learned recently, since about 2004, it's been a really transformative experience for me. You know, I was trained to treat what comes out of a pipe, but I was never trained to think about where that material comes from upstream, the landscape, and communities affected by that landscape. And I was never trained to recognize that even the best technologies can fail if people are not in a position to engage, not supportive of that engagement. And that is the most critical aspect that I think we need to bring into engineering and education and technology development. And so I'll expand on that in a minute, but I'll just move forward and talk about public health engineering and why I love the field I'm in. It's critical to recall, this is true of many regions globally, but I'll just use in US infectious disease crude death rates here, 1900 to 2000, to emphasize, and purposefully cut it off at 2000 because I don't want to get into the COVID pandemic, but some of these same insights would be represented. And what you see here in the left quadrant of these data is that indeed death rates really were affected, those associated with infectious disease, by technology, and our understanding of the critical importance of basic hygiene and sanitation, and of course the technologies we use to manage that. And so here's a cartoon from 1919 that has these technologies, you know, the filtration plant in the middle and chlorine really taking out, and they're quite graphic, but serve as a critical reminder that typhoid and other infectious diseases were these major causes of death, and technology changed that. In fact, 4 of the major causes, top 10 causes of death, changed in places like the United States, and certainly Canada, Europe, various parts of the world. And of course, these are still issues we're grappling with in other parts of the world. And as we look at what does that mean, it's been this broader approach of, yes, technology, but the integration of multiple barriers, of looking what's at our source. We can think of Love Canal and insights through the 80s of, maybe pollution is not a good idea of our water supply. We can look at the treatment technologies themselves, the technologies associated with evaluating whether that works, our ability to measure contaminants, and then ultimately distribute them and into communities, providing a key contributor to public health protection. Again, 4 of those major causes of death have changed. And really, where and how technology can help to advance water security and public health protection and moving forward, I think, is at a critical point right now. as we grapple, for me as an engineer, as we grapple with this challenge, this grand challenge, I've had this really especially transformative experience, as I was alluding to, and it is underscored for me the need to look both upstream beyond that intake pipe and downstream to communities and how people ultimately engage with and either accept or reject mitigation strategies for climate change adaptation, because we're dealing with extreme precipitation, we're dealing with fires. In 2004, we couldn't get funding to look at the implications of fire for communities and water security. We were told that these were one-off issues. What a difference 20 years makes. Species diversity, of course, sea level rise, water scarcity, and issues related to disturbances and climate shocks on the landscape. And so if we want to start to think of water security in many locations globally, probably 2/3 of the world, we're looking at forested landscapes as critical sources. They capture water. If they're healthy forests, they produce high quality water because they grow in regions where we have high levels of annual precipitation and produce large quantities of runoff with relatively low contaminant concentrations. We have this natural infiltration capacity in these systems, in their root systems, and then ultimately that water is delivered to lakes and rivers. So high quality water from forested source watersheds has been both numerous and substantial, and really led to many economic benefits. And one of these is the one that often limits us in terms of recognizing that there's a crisis, because high quality source water, high quality drinking water, often precludes the need for extensive drinking water treatment and associated infrastructure costs. Landscapes and communities that have less of a history of development are most primed to manage their landscapes such that we can nurture it and the water it provides. There have been studies, of course, widely that in general say that the more healthy forest cover you have, you can increase treatment costs. For every 10% increase in forest cover, and this is what this is getting at, this figure now, which is a bit dated from 2004, but it's still quite relevant, which it says that for every 10% increase in forest cover, you have approximately 20% decrease in treatment costs up to a point. And some of these unfilled points here emphasize that we're talking about, of course, this concept of healthy forests. And of course, this is a simplification, but it's an important and relevant simplification. And so in a changing climate, where we might have blowdown from hurricanes, pest infestation in the left corner here, fires, catastrophic fires, the bottom right image is Fort McMurray. We need to think about how can we increase resilience and ensure water security. And now I want to pause for a moment and talk about what I mean by water security, because this is where some of the confusion with the role of technology comes into play. So I wanted to talk about some key drinking water security insights that are coming out of a wildfire shocks context that I've had the opportunity to work in. And so wildfire, without getting into too many details, wildfire can be especially hard on water because it alters water quality, and it can do so for a long period of time. And so we expect this degradation, and the question is always, how big is that impact? Because there might be no impact. What is that impact? How long might it last? And you can see, we can actually transform landscapes from these beautiful Albertan and British Columbia images here that look like these images that people make beer commercials out of, high quality, almost pristine. We never use the word pristine because no water is safe from a public health perspective because there's organisms in it. But the question is, how hard is it to treat? And so when you go from these beautiful blue waters to now having a lot of this material that is displeasing to look at, but also carries with it contaminants that can lead to nutrient buildup, algal blooms, toxins over long periods of time, you start to worry. But so let's talk about the technology role in that understanding, because we can treat water. And what most people find surprising is in these big pieces of infrastructure where you have these multiple processes, you see drivers like solids, organics, the need to remove algae. What we're not talking about is contaminants. But if you can remove the solids and the contaminants that they carry, and a lot of this natural nutrient material, organics among them, so carbon, but also other nutrients that lead to organisms growing, if you can remove a lot of that, then you can disinfect the water, deal with the public health threats, and you have essentially safe drinking water. If you have some of these contaminants of typically anthropogenic or man-made origin, then you need more advanced, sophisticated technologies that really increase the costs. But when we talk about design of treatment systems, these are not a driver. They're one big category. And when we operate and design plants otherwise for all landscapes, really it comes down to turbidity, which is a way of measuring the solids or the clarity of water, and then color and organic carbon, which are TOC is total organic carbon. They're interrelated, but that's it. Those parameters can be used to inform, do you need all of this infrastructure, this conventional infrastructure? Can you bypass some of this large footprint infrastructure and just have disinfection or something in between? Very few parameters are actually going to drive that treatment process that you have to monitor on an ongoing basis. Most people find that really surprising. And what ends up happening is when we built these treatment processes, they're designed to respond to a range of contaminants. That's what we as engineers like to do. We like control, after all. And so we need that resilience, and we've designed for that resilience. And so in a changing climate, this concept of resilience comes into play, because now if we look at this fire scenario, we've got three types of systems: reference, because we don't control landscapes, so we call them reference. So green is unburned, black is burned, and this browny orange is not only burned, but then we go in and we have even more insult on the landscape, and we're hauling out those trees, hoping that they have some commercial value. And so we've got turbidity and suspended solids or sediment concentration, both indicating those solids. Look at this landscape in Alberta, right? Clearly there's going to be material washing off. And so what we see here is the first 4 years post-fire in multiple watersheds in Alberta. And these are just average values. And I'll point out that they're on a log scale. So the small differences actually on this figure is quite large. And this gets at an important point. We have a few years, and there's this idea that we have these materials wash off the landscape into our water supply, and then they flush through. And sure enough, these levels are going down. But if you're a person who is integrated in climate science and understanding the connectivity between climate and hydrology, so hydroclimatology or hydroclimatic impacts, what you'd see if you could convince your funding agency to keep funding your research is that this is just because those years were dry. On Canadian landscapes, we have so much of a history of glaciation and all these sedimentary or soil deposits, fine solids, that actually this material slowly washes off the landscape, and you can have a legacy of impacts for decades or longer. We also see that you have to understand the science of the landscape and recognize that it's not during the typical flow conditions, but when there's more energy in rivers, this is now carbon concentration, that these materials are increasingly moved through these systems. And because there's transformation of these materials, both on the landscape and in water bodies, this is carbon character, and it speaks to how reactive that carbon is in our treatment plants. I don't want to get into the details, but again, in these unburned versus highly burned systems, in this case, you see these shifts. And so what you used to measure as carbon now has a different character. And so you need different technology to gauge that. And on this image, it's the same for solids. And you can see the types of remote areas and massive landscapes we're talking about. And so how this connects to technology is that we're talking about micro scale processes and the organisms and the chemical attributes of water quality and how they're transforming across large landscapes. And we need the tools to measure them, and our tools are limited. And our ability to get out into these large landscapes is limited. And this is important because if you think about these, if you think about Fort McMurray, over 100 square kilometers of land, are we going to have an impact of the fire in 2016? Only 5% of the land burned. Maybe we won't. But what you can see, this is work from southern Alberta, is you have these massive landscapes that are hard to get to. We try to deploy technologies to collect samples, but of course they can be washed away during high flow conditions. But in this particular study that we had the benefit of being involved in, Mike Stone, who is online, has led this study. We could look over 1,000 kilometers downstream and ask people, did you see an impact of the fire? And they said no initially. Second year, no. 6 years later, we don't understand where these algae blooms are coming from. And Mike's team went on, deployed samples in partnership with colleagues from Great Britain, and did some source tracking, some fingerprinting. And we said, sure enough, these materials did get transported downstream. You can see the signature clearly there of the fire in this system. And we were able to show that greater than 80% of this impact came from a small fraction, less than 14% of the landscape. And as a spoiler alert, I'll tell you that in Fort McMurray, we saw impact from even less than 5% of the landscape. So if you don't go to these hotspots, if you don't have the technology to identify them, and then to do these evaluations, which are again, huge landscape scale, and then you have to have reliability in the analyses, you can miss the impact. Fort McMurray was a great example of that. This is another study we were involved in where we were looking at watersheds, so over 100,000 square kilometers versus a plant in the middle of it. And was there an impact for drinking water? If you looked on average at the water treatment, or rather water quality across the watershed, you might say, you know what, on average, there's no change, but there's a change in the extremes. The extremes are more extreme. And this gets to a key point of how frequently do you want to have access to your water? On average or all the time, even during extremes? And what we saw in Fort McMurray was very clearly something that we know about big rivers, which is they don't mix well. And you get this pattern of imperfect and unpredictable mixing. And here is a plume coming out of that landscape right into the intake of the water treatment plant. And they're now looking at probably tens of millions of dollars of upgrades. And that fire was in 2016. That system's continuing to evolve. And they're going to need more treatment technology to manage these challenges that we would have never designed for otherwise. And this is where I would say that from a technology and treatment perspective, fire is especially important to study, because when you look at this range of different climate shocks, if you can be resilient to wildfire, which can be the hardest on water, you can be resilient to a variety of climate shocks. And so although the landscapes are unique and the challenges are unique with each climate shock, from a treatability perspective, the range of issues you need to look at and the technologies are universal that you use to respond. And so what is then the connection to health? And this is a reality that we have to deal with as people, and we usually don't like these types of realities. So I've talked about drinking water and water security, and I've been talking about treatment, and now I'd like to talk about the importance of treatability. There are many water values. There's recreational value, there's biodiversity, there's economic value. And if you think about contexts like fisheries and aquaculture, there's also spiritual value. But I would argue that in absence of safe drinking water, many of those other values take a back seat. And this is where I have issue with the concept of water security. Water security has been defined as sustainable access on a watershed basis to adequate quantities of water of acceptable quality to ensure human and ecosystem health. And I would propose that this concept of human and ecosystem health is impossible, this water security. It's an impossible ideal. Ideals we should strive towards, but at the end of the day, trade-offs have to be considered. And it's as simple as, which fish do you value? Some fish prefer deteriorated water. Post-fire in Alberta, in those high value fisheries areas for fly fishing, the fish, because of the deterioration, are bigger and fatter. They're healthy because there's more food for them to eat because of all of that productivity. The algae grow, then the bugs grow, the invertebrates that and macroinvertebrates that fish feed on. So do we value the landscape prior to the fire or after? It depends on what you prioritize. And that's why this is an impossible ideal. Landscapes aren't static, and we treat them as such. The other important consideration is that drinking water security does not equal water security. We have this idea that what's good for the fish is good for the people. That's not necessarily the case. Not at all, in fact. Is there overlap? Absolutely. But this issue of water security does not completely overlap ecosystems and humans. Because at the end of the day, as is shown in this image, we don't treat water, or we don't drink water from the lake or the river. There's a whole regulated and required treatment process, and it's part of this multi-barrier approach that I talked about. And so where we have historically focused is we focused technology on the treatment technology and on the testing and distribution technology. We have not done as well on the source protection side, and I'll elaborate on what I mean by that. And we certainly have not done as well on helping eliminate the barriers of uptake for technology. And so technology is not going to save you if there's no ability for people to accept it and adapt it. And so these are where the greatest opportunity lies. And when I talk about source water protection, there's this notion of contamination. And I'm going to come back to say that there's much more that I mean than just don't contaminate the water supply. Because again, some contaminated supplies are actually better for certain species. And so it depends on how you define contamination. So I'd like to suggest that focusing on this, what's encircled here in blue, is not the way to go. I'm not saying eliminate this focus, but I'm saying we've done really well here. Because at the end of the day, we can treat water. We can even treat water in space. I thought you might be interested in seeing what the treatment process looks like. It's compact, it's complicated, but it's excellent engineering, right? And here we have our Canadian astronauts in space using our water treatment systems. We're recycling every aspect of water on the space shuttle, and I would love to go into the details, but I won't. But the point from this is almost any target compound you throw at us can be treated, and those processes, those technologies are currently available. The question is, at what cost? And that's where we're not doing a good job, because low-cost technologies, I would argue, don't make money. This is an example of us proving that even the most severe black water post-fire, this is a pilot plant and one of the PhD students I supervise that we used in Alberta to take the blackest, most deteriorated water post-fire. And sure enough, using off-the-shelf products, we can treat it. Question is, how much money are people willing to spend on it? And of course, if you don't have the technology in place, there's of course years to implement it, and if an emergency happens. But we don't design plants. It is poor practice to design water treatment for a very rare event like a fire. And even today, those fires are still rare. So where we need to start to look, and where we're looking, is upstream. And so I've now included in this oval the source water protection concept. And this is where I want to touch on this issue of contamination. Historically, we've had watershed protection planning. Don't pollute. Don't dump anything into our water. Let's regulate industrial polluters. And that has gotten us so far. So I'm not suggesting that this isn't worthwhile. What I'm saying is we have to go to the next level now with technology. We can measure contaminants, and we need to keep advancing technology to measure contaminants and preclude contamination. But all of these fences don't work so well with wildfire and preventing Mother Nature from contaminating our water supplies or climate exacerbated disturbance. So when it comes back to these factors, these simple factors that drive treatment plant infrastructure needs and how easy it is to drive those treatment plants, we need to consider this concept of treatability. How easy is it to drive treatment? And this is where I would say, I'm a fan of Formula One driving. So I'll use that analogy. If you know anything about it, I'll touch on it regardless. If I was the F1 driver, I would not do a very good job because I don't have experience in F1 and I don't have a car. So let's go to F1. The car is the water treatment plant, the technology for treatment. The driver is the skilled operator. And those are integral components of success in treatment and success in Formula One. But that's not where we stop. If you know anything about Formula One, you know the pit crew is really important. They strategize, they gauge problems, they have telemetry. So the pit crew is our lab and the testing we do. Fantastic. Climate change is the track. Not all tracks are the same. Some of them go in one direction, some of them go in another direction. And I would say that climate change puts us in spaces where we're driving on a track we've never been on. It's a lot harder to perform. That's what we're dealing with. And then we have the community, we have to have the community buy-in that it's worth having, you know, and this is sort of where my analogy falls apart a bit, but we have to have the community buy-in for supporting that race. And that's where we need to overcome psychosocial obstacles and barriers to climate adaptation. And so in these last few slides a little bit, I'm going to go through quickly, but I just wanted to highlight opportunities for technology, which are that we've started engaging, but have so much more work to do with respect to the source protection. And it has to do with this concept of treatability and security, and various, not just our works, but certainly the IPCC has recognized that it's not just in-plant gray infrastructure, but it's watershed management, it's green infrastructure that also needs to be optimized for drinking water security. And it's more important than ever because we don't just have fires. We have fires and then we have rain on top of the fire, and then we have a flood, and then we have a landslide. And oh my goodness, fire can happen on top of fire. And we can't predict it. So the idea is resilience in technology, both built and green. And what is the intersection between managed forests? Is it green? Is it gray? Personally, I don't care what we call it, as long as we are able to increase our resilience. And so this concept of techno-ecological nature-based solutions has emerged to recognize that there's always going to be an aspect of man-made or built technology in managing green infrastructure, because it's about protection of public health, and we need those tools at a minimum. But what I hope you see here is our traditional thoughts around conservation and thou shalt not pollute. Don't do anything to the forest. Doesn't recognize that forests are not static. We've allowed fuels to accumulate, and what we need to do is nurture those forests so that they're resilient, so when a fire does come, they can bounce back. And that is a part of what we've been doing actually in the forWater network, is leveraging and integrating green and gray infrastructure to develop techno-ecological nature-based solutions. And so our technologies start to look like erosion control on the landscape, not as gray as you normally think of. And we can get to that place where we have resilient forests that really provide a strong first barrier in that multi-barrier approach for safe drinking water by being resilient, because resilient forests lead to resilient water. I'm really proud to share that in Canada, we have the first global partnership between a municipality and an industrial forestry company. It's no longer Spray Lake Sawmills, but they were the initiators of this, and it's their forest management plan. They are now owned, and they're now by West Fraser, and they're West Fraser Cochrane. But there was a partnership within the network where we focused on values, objectives, indicators, and targets. These are a component of regulated forest management plans, which forestry companies use to inform and direct implementation of all major strategies and how they interact with the landscape. This is voluntary at this point, but it's tremendously significant because it's the first partnership recognizing that forests need to be managed, not just for multiple values, but drinking water specifically needs to be prioritized. And so now, with the collaboration of developing these grants, we now want to, or these voights rather, we want to give them now some teeth, something that's actionable, and that's the process that we're in the middle of right now. I'm really proud to say other forestry companies like Tolko, which is a large multinational, are moving in this direction to partner, because there's a win-win here: resilient forests, resilient economy, resilient water, public health protection. And so our next big challenge, we have a lot to do in technology development here, but let's not forget, we still need to do better, because we really need to use a true systems approach. And so while we're moving in this space, we ultimately have to get to community impacts and individual action. And we need technology, yes, technology, to support us in engaging with people and removing those barriers to climate change adaptation. Because it's really tough to ask people to conserve or to pay a little more for water so that they have a longer term water supply if they can't put food on the table. And of course, we know that it's the rural, remote, and marginalized communities and populations that are going to be the most hard hit by this if we don't improve our broader systems thinking and deploy technology in a way that we need it. where it's going to have the most impact. So the key points that I've sort of summarized here, and opportunities for technology facilitated acceleration of drinking water security and public health protection I've listed here, they really pertain to changing how we think about these systems, recognizing that we can treat water. We don't, it's not that we shouldn't develop new treatment technologies, but they need to be lower cost. They need to be more cost effective. And we need to think about response capacity, that treatment resilience, because it's especially critical in a changing climate, because you can't put a fence around your water supply and ask Mother Nature to please ignore it because we're trying to conserve our drinking water. So we need to do better. We need to focus on treatability, not just contamination, and then resilience in that treatment. And we need to develop tools and technologies for removing barriers to adaptation. And the last part I'll say is data. You know, but a lot of people ask me about artificial intelligence, and it's like, we don't have the data. Data from remote areas, we need information, we need to understand systems, and we need data across a massive, and I mean massive, range of temporal and spatial scales. Minutes to years temporally, and micro scale to watershed scale. One of my favorite statements in looking at post-fire data, I remember a watershed scientist said to me, oh, we had pretty rapid recovery after the fire. And I just looked at that person and I said, what is the air like on the planet you live on? And why did I say that? They said, oh, this community bounced back after fire within 3 years. And I said, in the drinking water treatment world, rapid, resilience is 3 hours. How long are you willing to go without water? Safe water in your community? Chances are it's not going to be 3 years. So that lexicon, that collaborative language, we need to speak the same language, and it needs to be reflected in our technology choices, because we've thrown ourselves off in some aspects of technology, and wanting to build the next widget to treat water is certainly one of them. So we need to develop the tools, but they need to be the right tools, and we need to have data for high frequency real-time monitoring, because people want safe water in real time. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. This work is enabled, and the ability to think about this work is enabled by a massive range of partners. I'd be very happy to chat if anybody wants to chat about these opinions. So thank you.